Alan Jackson stepped into the bustling terminal at O'Hare International. Just another face in the sea of early morning travelers. Dressed in a pair of well-worn jeans, a comfortable blue sweater, and sturdy walking shoes. He looked nothing like the powerful CEO of Skyline Airways. The salt and pepper hair, the creases around his eyes, the easy smile, nothing about him suggested he was anything more than an average passenger about to board an average flight. And that was exactly the way he liked it. Every few weeks, Alan would slip out of the spotlight, leaving behind the world of board meetings and corporate perks. Today, he was simply Alan, just another traveler with a ticket, a laptop, and a quiet curiosity about the company he ran. As he ordered a coffee at the airport cafe, he blended into the scene so perfectly that the barista didn't look twice. Alan paid like everyone else. His credit card swiped and returned without the slightest hint of recognition. Skyline might sign her paychecks. But here, he was just another customer. He glanced at his watch, realizing he still had a full hour before boarding. Finding an empty seat near the gate, he settled in and pulled out his laptop, though he barely looked at it. Instead, he watched the people around him, the young gate agent cheerfully helping an elderly woman with her boarding pass, a family struggling with a stroller and bags, the businessman pacing while barking orders into his phone. Alan absorbed it all. Every detail, every interaction. This was where the real insights came from. These moments he could never experience from the executive floor. A soft buzz in his pocket brought him out of his thoughts. A notification from the Skyline app flashed on his screen: "Your flight has been upgraded to first class." He frowned slightly, debating whether he should switch back to economy. Alan had always preferred sitting among regular passengers. It kept him grounded, reminded him of the experiences that mattered most. But before he could adjust the booking, the gate agent announced the start of pre-boarding. As he made his way through the crowd, memories floated up, years of long, cold shifts loading bags onto planes, of learning the ropes as a customer service representative, handling irate travelers and weather delays with a practiced calm. Every role he'd held over the years, from those early days in baggage handling to the CEO's office, had taught him something about the heartbeat of this business. Now, as he stepped into first class, those memories hummed in the back of his mind, as vivid as if they'd happened yesterday. Taking his seat by the window, Alan relaxed into the familiar routine of boarding. The soft hum of overhead bins being shut, the shuffling of feet, the murmurs of passengers, all the usual symphony of takeoff. A businessman in a crisp suit sat down beside him, nodding politely before burying himself in his phone, clearly uninterested in small talk with the casually dressed man in 2A. The boarding continued, and Alan's gaze wandered, noting the small but telling interactions around him. He observed how some first-class passengers turned their shoulders slightly, a subtle but unmistakable gesture, as others filed past them toward economy. He'd seen these micro-expressions 1,000 times before, little glimpses of judgment, unspoken assumptions. Even after years in this business, these moments still struck him. A young flight attendant approached, her name tag reading Emily, her demeanor polished and professional. Yet, there was a hint of something else, a subtle coldness when she addressed passengers who didn't fit the image she expected in first class. She smiled warmly at the businessman beside him, offering a drink, but her eyes barely flickered in Alan's direction as she handed him a napkin with practiced indifference. It was a small thing, almost imperceptible, but he noticed. He always noticed. Alan leaned back in his seat, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth as he pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. Sometimes, the most revealing details came from these quiet moments, hidden in the space between pleasantries. As the engines roared to life and the plane began to taxi, he started jotting down his observations, unaware that today's flight would become one of the most unforgettable journeys of his career. As the plane climbed above the Chicago skyline, Alan found himself watching the cabin more than the view outside his window. Passengers were settling into their routines, laptops flicked open, blankets pulled up, seatbacks reclined. But his attention drifted to the young flight attendant moving through the first-class aisle, her name badge gleaming under the cabin lights, Emily. With every polished step, she wore an air of strict professionalism, a demeanor that at first glance seemed efficient, even admirable. But Alan quickly sensed there was more beneath the surface. Emily's interactions were smooth, courteous, yet tinged with something Alan had seen all too often, a subtle sense of judgment. It was in the way her smile barely reached her eyes, the slight downturn of her lips as she glanced over passengers who didn't meet her unspoken standards. Her attention lingered on the businessman beside him, offering a drink with an almost exaggerated warmth, her tone softening as she addressed him. When she turned to Alan, however, her entire demeanor shifted. Her tone became cool, almost clipped, as though she were fulfilling an obligation. "Would you care for something to drink, sir?" she asked, barely looking at him. Alan kept his expression neutral, masking the flicker of disappointment beneath. "Just water, please," he replied quietly, observing her reaction. Emily's polite mask slipped, just for a moment, her eyes sweeping over his casual clothes and worn shoes with a glint of disapproval. She turned briskly and returned moments later with his water, setting it down almost perfunctorily before moving on without another glance. Settling back in his seat, Alan took a sip of water, his mind racing with thoughts. He'd spent years working to build an airline that prided itself on equal treatment for all passengers, whether they sat in economy or first class. Policies, trainings, countless meetings, all with the intention of fostering a culture of respect and inclusion. But seeing Emily's behavior now, he wondered just how much of that message had truly filtered down to the front lines. Across the aisle, a young man in a casual hoodie and sneakers, a tech worker, by the looks of it, was eagerly adjusting to his first-class seat. Emily's reaction was immediate and sharp. When he asked for water, her reply was curt, almost dismissive. "We'll start beverage service once we're at cruising altitude," she said, barely masking her disdain. The young man blinked, clearly taken aback. He mumbled a quick apology and turned his gaze to the window, his enthusiasm visibly deflated. Alan felt a pang of frustration watching the exchange. Here was a passenger who had been excited to experience first class, treated as though he were an intruder. Alan made a quick note in his leather-bound notebook, jotting down his observations with the same meticulousness he applied to every aspect of the airline. He noted the subtle shift in Emily's demeanor when speaking to certain passengers, the barely perceptible shift in her posture as she interacted with people she seemed to deem less worthy of first-class amenities. It was clear to him that Emily wasn't just enforcing company policies, she was creating invisible hierarchies within the cabin itself. As the plane leveled out, the captain's voice crackled over the PA, announcing their flight time to Seattle and wishing everyone a comfortable journey. Alan smiled at the sound of Captain Sarah Chen's voice, one of Skyline's most experienced pilots. He'd promoted her just last year, recognizing her skill and commitment. She was proof that dedication and hard work could overcome any bias or limitation. Meanwhile, Emily resumed her service, now bringing drinks to the passengers she deemed worthy. The businessman next to Alan received his Bloody Mary with a small bowl of warmed nuts, served with a sweetness that seemed almost performative. Alan watched Emily's every move, noting the way her body language opened up for some, and closed off to others. A voice from across the aisle broke the silence. "Excuse me, would it be possible to get some water now?" It was the young tech worker again, hesitant yet hopeful. Emily paused, her lips pursed, her gaze darting to the businessman's empty glass before landing back on the young man with an unmistakable hint of impatience. "As I mentioned, we'll be starting our beverage service shortly," she replied, barely masking her irritation. She turned her back on him before he could respond, and Alan saw the tech worker sink further into his seat, reaching for his earbuds to escape the uncomfortable moment. Alan felt a tightening in his chest, a quiet but growing frustration. This was why he took these flights. This was why he dressed like an average passenger, sat among everyday travelers, and observed from behind an unremarkable facade. Policies and training modules could only go so far, sometimes. The only way to see the truth was to experience it firsthand. He closed his notebook, carefully tucking it back into his bag. For now, he would let Emily's behavior play out, allowing her to reveal herself fully. He wanted to see if her actions were a momentary lapse or a symptom of something larger, a mindset he would have to address, not just with Emily, but perhaps across the entire company. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and as passengers moved around the cabin, Alan leaned back, folding his hands over his lap as he continued to observe the flight with a watchful eye. Today's flight was about to become more than just another observation trip. It was becoming a first-hand study in human behavior, in hidden prejudices, and, ultimately, in the change he knew was necessary. The plane hummed softly as it settled into its cruising altitude, slicing through the endless blue. In the first-class cabin, the sounds of quiet conversation and clinking glasses filled the air, each passenger wrapped in their own world. But Alan's attention was fixed on Emily, her every move a window into something deeper, something unsettling. Emily's demeanor had shifted again. She was all smiles and attentiveness for the wealthier-looking passengers, her voice soft, her laugh light, as if she were tending to royalty. But for those who didn't meet her silent standards, like the young tech worker across the aisle, her tone grew flat, her expressions distant. Alan noticed it in the way her eyes barely met theirs, her gestures mechanical and devoid of warmth. When she approached the businessman beside him, her tone brightened. "Another Bloody Mary, sir?" she asked, her voice laced with a familiar, syrupy politeness. "Sure. Make it extra spicy this time," the man said, flashing a brief smile. Emily responded with a quick nod, retrieving his glass with almost theatrical care. Alan watched her closely, noting the small, unspoken favoritism, the divide she was creating between passengers who belonged and those she seemed to view as intruders. He'd seen this kind of behavior before, and it troubled him deeply. This wasn't just about Emily, it was about a lingering bias that had no place in his airline. The young tech worker across the aisle fidgeted, hesitantly pressing his call button. Alan saw him glance at Emily as she approached, a hint of unease flickering across his face. "Yes?" Emily said curtly, her polite mask thinning as she looked at him. Could I get a glass of water now?" he asked. His voice soft. "We'll begin our full beverage service shortly," she replied. Her voice edged with impatience, as though she were granting a favor. She didn't wait for his response. Instead, spinning on her heel to return to the galley, Alan noticed the young man's face fall, his shoulders slumping as he retreated into his seat, visibly uncomfortable. Alan's hand tightened around his notebook. He'd built Skyline with a commitment to treating every passenger with dignity. Yet here was one of his employees creating a hierarchy right in front of him. He debated saying something, but held back, choosing instead to observe. Sometimes, letting a situation play out gave more insight than immediate intervention. He returned his attention to Emily, who had just finished delivering the businessman's drink. A pregnant woman from the economy cabin approached, her steps slow and careful as she made her way to the first-class lavatory. Alan noticed her wince, one hand bracing her lower back. Emily intercepted her with a brisk step, her posture stiff and unyielding. "This lavatory is reserved for first-class passengers only," she announced, her tone icily polite. "There are facilities in the back of the plane." The woman's face flushed, her discomfort evident. "It's just that, the lines are really long back there," she said quietly, one hand resting protectively over her belly. "Policy is policy," Emily replied, gesturing toward the back of the plane with a tight-lipped smile. Without another word, the woman turned, visibly embarrassed, and began the slow walk back to economy. Alan's jaw clenched. He made a note to revisit the policy, particularly in cases like this. Watching the woman struggle back down the aisle, he felt a pang of frustration. Emily's rigid enforcement wasn't just unkind, it was unnecessary. By now, a few passengers in first class had noticed Emily's behavior. Their glances filled with curiosity, some even with unease. Alan watched as she resumed her duties, barely concealing her disapproval as she moved past passengers who didn't fit her standards of premium appearance. The businessman beside him finished his drink and pressed his call button, and Emily appeared almost instantly, smiling warmly. "Another, sir?" "Please," he nodded, as she refilled his glass. Her gaze flickered to Alan's seat, her smile fading as she regarded his casual attire and well-worn sweater. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Can I get you anything, sir?" she asked. But her tone made it clear she was asking out of obligation, not genuine interest. "Just water." "Thank you," Alan replied, keeping his tone neutral. He saw her pause, barely suppressing a look of distaste, before nodding curtly and turning away. But the moment Alan reached for his water, he felt Emily's shadow lingering, her gaze pointed and unkind. She took a step closer, her expression tightening. And then, in a voice that carried a hint of warning, she asked, "Sir, could I see your boarding pass?" Alan looked up, a mix of surprise and curiosity in his eyes. "Is there a problem?" "No," she replied, a touch too quickly. "We've just had some issues with seat assignments lately, and I want to make sure everything's in order." A murmur ran through the cabin as a few nearby passengers turned to watch. The young tech worker across the aisle looked up, clearly sensing the tension, his gaze flickering between Alan and Emily. Alan reached calmly for his phone, pulling up his boarding pass. "Here it is," he said, holding it up for her to see. She examined the screen, her eyes narrowing. "I see, Mr. Jackson." Her voice betrayed a note of disbelief, as if the very idea of him belonging in first class was an affront to her expectations. She straightened, still unsatisfied. "Perhaps there's been a system error. Our premium cabin passengers usually present themselves differently." Alan's eyebrow lifted, but he said nothing, waiting to see how far she'd take it. "Usually what?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm, the authority in his tone unmistakable. Emily hesitated, visibly searching for a way to express herself without breaking protocol. "Usually, they look different," she said, her hand gesturing vaguely at his sweater and jeans. "They meet certain standards." The businessman beside Alan had put down his phone, now openly watching the exchange. The young man in the hoodie across the aisle raised an eyebrow, a knowing smirk playing on his lips. Alan could see how Emily's professionalism was unraveling, her polished demeanor cracking under the weight of her own assumptions. As he observed her floundering, Alan felt the quiet anger he'd been suppressing rise to the surface. He'd worked his entire career to instill a culture of respect and dignity at Skyline. Yet here was one of his own employees openly questioning his right to a seat based on nothing more than his appearance. He'd let it play out long enough. With a calm, steady voice, he spoke. "Emily, I think we need to have a conversation about assumptions," he said, meeting her gaze, "and about how we treat all of our passengers." Emily froze, her face paling as she realized the implication of his words. Nearby passengers watched, some murmuring quietly, others merely staring in silence. Alan continued, "Let me ask you something. Emily, do you think respect should be determined by someone's appearance? By their clothes?" Emily stammered. "And no, sir. It's just, in first class, we have certain standards. And we And who sets those standards? Alan asked. His voice sharp yet calm. Is it Skyline's policy? Or your own? Emily's face flushed as she struggled for a response. Alan saw her hesitation. The way her carefully crafted professionalism was unraveling. And in that moment, he knew that today's flight would mark a turning point, not just for Emily, but for the very culture he'd built at Skyline. As silence settled over the cabin, Emily's gaze dropped, her confidence fading. Alan returned his attention to his notebook, knowing that this was only the beginning of a much-needed conversation. The plane had settled comfortably into cruising altitude, gliding through a clear sky. But in the first-class cabin, the atmosphere was anything but smooth. Alan sat back, seemingly relaxed. Yet his mind was anything but. Emily's demeanor was becoming more pronounced. Her behavior marked by a subtle yet unmistakable hierarchy she seemed determined to enforce. She moved through the cabin like a guard of first-class standards, her face an ever-shifting mask depending on whom she served. Alan watched as she approached the businessman next to him. Her expression brightened, her voice dripping with courtesy. Another Bloody Mary. Sir, she asked. Her tone so warm it was almost unrecognizable from her earlier clipped replies. Sure. Make it extra spicy this time, he responded with a grin. Emily flashed a quick smile and whisked away his empty glass, her attention all but ignoring Alan beside him. She brought the businessman's drink back promptly, setting it down with a slight flourish. An unnecessary display of formality that made her favoritism unmistakable. Alan watched her intently, noting each slight adjustment in her behavior, each calculated interaction. She was creating divides, unseen but deeply felt. Across the aisle, the young man in the hoodie sat patiently, still adjusting to his new surroundings. He pressed his call button, hesitant but hopeful. Alan saw the flicker of apprehension in the young man's eyes as Emily approached, her stance suddenly stiffer, her polite mask thinning. Yes, she said, her voice losing its warmth. Could I, get a glass of water? The young man asked, his words quiet. Emily let out a sigh that barely registered, but Alan noticed. We'll begin full beverage service once we're at cruising altitude, she replied, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. She turned her back to him without waiting for his response, her entire demeanor dismissive. The young man's face fell, his confidence visibly shaken, and he pulled out his phone, shrinking into his seat. Alan's hand tightened around his notebook. He'd seen this behavior before. In far too many places, a quiet, insidious form of discrimination that undermined people's dignity. He had designed Skyline's entire customer service ethos to treat every passenger equally, to make them feel welcome. But watching Emily's behavior now, he felt a quiet anger stirring inside him, a determination to address the cracks he was seeing in his company's culture. A ripple of murmurs traveled through the cabin as a pregnant woman from economy made her way up to the first-class lavatory, moving slowly, one hand supporting her lower back. Alan's gaze tracked her, seeing the exhaustion etched on her face, the slight wince with each step. But before she could reach the door, Emily intercepted her with a swift, practiced motion. This lavatory is reserved for first-class passengers only, she said, her voice dripping with a thinly veiled irritation. There are facilities at the back of the plane. The woman looked startled, glancing back at the crowded economy cabin. It's just, there's a line. Policy is policy. Emily cut her off with a tight-lipped smile, her hand gesturing toward the rear of the plane as if she'd settled the matter. The woman hesitated, her face a mix of discomfort and embarrassment. But with a reluctant nod, she turned and began the slow, weary walk back to economy. Alan watched her go, feeling a pang of frustration. There was no need for such rigid enforcement. Not in a case like this. He made a note in his book, revisit lavatory access policy for special circumstances. But as he wrote, he knew it wasn't just the policy that needed revisiting. Emily's behavior was undermining everything he had built Skyline to stand for. Alan's thoughts were interrupted by the businessman pressing his call button again. Emily appeared in seconds, smiling with a kind of reverence that bordered on theatrical. Another. Sir? Yes. Please, he said, grinning. Emily nodded, her smile unwavering as she took his glass. Her gaze flickered to Alan's empty water glass, and her expression shifted. The warm facade faded, replaced with a look of reluctant duty. Can I get you anything, sir? She asked. But her voice was hollow, as if she were fulfilling an obligation. Just water. Thank you, Alan replied, his tone polite but distant. She returned moments later, setting the glass down almost carelessly. Alan didn't react, but he felt the weight of her disdain. The way her eyes skimmed over his casual clothes as though he were an intruder in this premium space. It was subtle, but it was there, clear as day to anyone paying attention. As she moved to leave, he cleared his throat. Excuse me, miss, he said, his voice gentle but firm. Emily paused, glancing over her shoulder. Sir? Could I trouble you to check the seating arrangement? He asked, holding her gaze. I'd like to make sure there's no mistake about my seat here. Her eyes flickered with a glint of suspicion, and for a moment, She seemed caught off guard. She straightened, a look of almost hidden triumph crossing her face. Yes. I'll just verify your boarding pass. Then, she said, her voice regaining its usual polish. Her words carried a hint of condescension, as if she were humoring him. Alan calmly reached into his pocket, pulling up his digital boarding pass on his phone and holding it out for her. Here you go. She scrutinized the screen with exaggerated care, her lips pressing together. Mr. Jackson, she said, her tone incredulous, as though his name should have carried some unspoken qualification. It must be a system error. Our premium cabin passengers typically present themselves differently. Alan raised an eyebrow, watching her closely. Different in what way? He asked, his voice level. Emily hesitated, her eyes darting to the businessman next to him, whose tailored suit and polished shoes matched her invisible checklist. Well, usually. She gestured vaguely at his sweater and jeans, her tone carrying an unspoken criticism. Alan kept his gaze steady, his expression calm but unyielding. So, you're saying first-class passengers are expected to dress a certain way? Well, she stammered, her face flushing slightly. Our standards, it's about creating a certain atmosphere. An atmosphere based on appearances, Alan said, his voice just loud enough for the businessman next to him and a few other curious passengers to overhear. Emily's composure cracked slightly, her cheeks reddening as she struggled for a response. She'd misread him, dismissed him as an ordinary passenger, and now she was being forced to explain herself. Nearby, the young man in the hoodie watched, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. Alan took a breath, his tone firm but controlled. I believe in creating an inclusive experience for all passengers, regardless of their appearance. Skyline doesn't base respect on what people wear. The businessman next to him shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly aware of the scrutiny now focused on Emily. Passengers in nearby rows were turning, curious glances flicking from Alan to Emily. Alan leaned forward slightly. Emily, may I ask you something? He said, his voice calm yet filled with an authority that cut through the cabin's low murmur. She swallowed, her face paling slightly. Of course, sir. Would you say I'm in my proper place? Alan asked, a hint of steel in his voice. Or are you suggesting that appearances should dictate the respect passengers receive? Emily froze, her professional facade splintering. A faint flush crept up her cheeks as she grasped for a response. No, of course not, sir. I was only trying to maintain standards. Standards, Alan repeated, his tone laced with quiet intensity. I suggest you take a moment to reflect on what that word means, and how it should apply to every passenger on this plane. The businessman shifted again, clearly uncomfortable with the tension building in the cabin. Alan's gaze didn't waver from Emily, and she found herself unable to meet his eyes. A quiet fell over the nearby rows as passengers observed the confrontation with rapt attention. Finally, Alan leaned back, his voice softening. Sometimes, the standards we enforce are less about the rules and more about our own assumptions. With that, he turned back to his seat, letting his words hang in the air, a silent reminder of the unseen biases that often went unchallenged. Emily's face had drained of color, her gaze cast down, and in that moment, she seemed to fully realize the impact of her behavior. Alan watched as she retreated to the galley, her composure rattled. He made a quiet note in his book, knowing that today's flight had become much more than just another observation. It was the start of a shift, one that would ripple through Skyline's culture, and maybe, if he did his job right, change more than just the behavior of a single flight attendant. Alan tried to settle back into his seat, hoping the confrontation with Emily would leave her with a chance to reflect. But he could still feel the tension radiating from the galley, where she had disappeared moments ago. Nearby, passengers exchanged curious glances, and the young man in the hoodie was openly watching him, a mix of empathy and quiet satisfaction in his expression. The cabin crew had begun regular service, and another flight attendant, Chris, moved through the aisles with a calm, friendly smile. Unlike Emily, Chris seemed to treat every passenger with the same respect, whether they were first-class regulars or young tech workers in hoodies. He greeted Alan as if he were any other passenger, placing a small tray with snacks and a bottle of water on his table. Meanwhile, Emily re-emerged from the galley with a tray balanced on one hand. She appeared tense, her face flushed and her movements quick and mechanical. Alan watched her carefully, hoping she had taken his words to heart, but as she approached, her eyes flicked over his worn sweater and jeans with barely concealed contempt. She turned to the businessman beside him, all smiles and warmth once again. Another Bloody Mary, sir? She asked, her voice as smooth as silk. Please. And extra spicy, the businessman replied, grinning as he accepted the drink. Emily placed it down with precision, adding a small dish of warmed nuts to his tray, her entire demeanor polished and poised. Then she turned to Alan, her eyes cold and hard. Anything for you, sir? She asked, her tone sharp and devoid of warmth. Just water. Thank you, Alan replied quietly, matching her gaze with calm resolve. Emily reached for his empty glass. For a second, Alan thought she was simply going to refill it, but as she lifted the glass, her grip shifted, and a single, quick movement sent it tipping forward. Orange juice cascaded over the rim, splashing across Alan's lap and onto his laptop. The businessman gasped, jerking back in his seat, and several nearby passengers audibly reacted, a few even sitting up straighter to watch. "Oh dear," Emily said, her voice flat, barely masking her satisfaction. "Accidents do happen." She held out a single napkin, her lips curled in a faint, almost defiant smile. Alan took the napkin, dabbing at the juice on his sweater, keeping his expression steady. The silence in the cabin felt thick, as if everyone were holding their breath, waiting for his reaction. Across the aisle, the young tech worker was recording with his phone, his face a mixture of shock and barely hidden approval. The businessman next to Alan shifted uncomfortably, clearly feeling the tension between them. Alan took a slow breath, choosing his words carefully. "Emily," he said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority, "I think you've done enough for now. Perhaps another member of the crew could handle the rest of the service." Her eyes widened slightly, her mouth opening as if to respond, but she quickly closed it, her face paling as his words registered. The nearby flight attendant, Chris, approached cautiously, a stack of towels in his hand, and the senior attendant, Karen, appeared at his side, her expression one of concern. "Mr. Jackson," Karen said softly, her voice apologetic as she handed him a fresh towel. "I'm so sorry. We'll take care of this." "No need to apologize, Karen," Alan replied, giving her a reassuring nod. He turned back to Emily, his gaze steady. "Please, Emily, take a few minutes to collect yourself." Emily's face had turned an even deeper shade of red, and the barely hidden satisfaction she displayed moments before had been replaced by a look of disbelief and growing shame. She opened her mouth, as if to argue, but a quick glance at Karen's stern expression silenced her. With a stiff nod, she turned and disappeared into the galley. Alan could feel the weight of the passengers' eyes on him, the silent intrigue filling the cabin. He kept his composure, calmly wiping the juice from his laptop and brushing off his sweater. Though the stain had already set, he knew that this incident, however small it seemed, represented something far more significant, a test of the very culture he was trying to build within Skyline. Chris bent down beside him, handing over a stack of napkins. "Again, I'm really sorry, sir. We'll have everything cleaned up for you," he murmured, his voice genuinely apologetic. Alan nodded, grateful for Chris's professionalism. "Thank you, Chris. I appreciate it." The senior flight attendant, Karen, gave him an encouraging look before returning to the galley. Alan could hear muffled voices behind the curtain, Emily's high-pitched tone rising and falling in what sounded like frustration or disbelief. Chris continued his duties, moving through the aisle with a composed, genuine smile, easing the tension that had settled over the cabin. As the plane continued its journey through the sky, Alan leaned back, his mind already racing with ideas on how to address what he had witnessed today. He knew he would need to do more than reprimand a single employee. This was a cultural issue, a systemic bias that would need to be addressed at every level of his company. Moments later, Karen re-emerged from the galley, her face a mask of professional calm. "Mr. Jackson," she said quietly, "Emily would like to speak with you, if you're willing." Alan considered this, his expression thoughtful. He knew that confronting her now, mid-flight, might yield some answers. Yet he also knew that real change didn't come from one heated exchange but from a deeper understanding, a chance for true reflection. "Yes, I'll speak with her," he replied, standing slowly. As he made his way to the galley, he felt the weight of the passengers' stares, each glance a reminder of the trust they'd placed in Skyline. He stepped into the galley to find Emily seated on the jump seat, her eyes red, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked up as he entered, and for a moment, the defiance he'd seen earlier was gone, replaced by something closer to regret. "Mr. Jackson," she began, her voice small. I didn't know who you were. I just thought you were another passenger." Alan Methargaze, his expression unwavering. "And would that have changed anything, Emily? Should it matter who I am? Or should every passenger receive the same respect?" She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her shoulders slumped, her confidence visibly deflated. Alan continued, his voice softer but firm. "Tell me, Emily, why do you believe first-class passengers should look or act a certain way? Where did that idea come from?" She hesitated, then let out a shaky breath. I don't know," she admitted, her eyes dropping to the floor. "I thought I was doing my job. I thought that was what the company expected." Alan nodded, taking a moment to absorb her words. He had seen this before, a silent, unspoken prejudice passed down through habits and assumptions, never questioned, just reinforced by those who believed they were upholding standards. "Emily," he said gently, "I built Skyline to be more than that. Our standards aren't about clothes or appearances. They're about respect. About dignity. About treating every person on board with the same level of care. She blinked, looking away, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. I see that now. No excuses. Alan interrupted, though his tone remained calm. You'll have to own this. And understand it's not about me being the CEO. It's about everyone on this plane who has entrusted us to treat them with respect. Emily's face crumpled slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry, Mr. Jackson. I didn't think. Alan nodded, sensing the sincerity behind her words. I hope you mean that, Emily, because what comes next will require you to think very hard about the impact of your actions. As he turned to leave, he added, I'll expect a detailed report from you by the end of the week on today's events. Yes, but more than that, I want you to reflect on what it means to represent Skyline, and what you can do differently moving forward. He left her there, returning to his seat with a calm resolve. As he sat down, he could feel the eyes of passengers around him, watching with a newfound respect. A silent acknowledgement of the stand he had taken. Today, Alan knew, was a turning point, not only for Emily but for Skyline itself. This was a reminder of the work that still lay ahead, of the need to push for change in every detail, every interaction, no matter how small. He picked up his notebook once more, his pen moving across the page with renewed determination. Today had been challenging, even uncomfortable, but as he wrote, he knew it was exactly what Skyline needed to grow. The rest of the flight proceeded in a tense silence, each passenger acutely aware of the drama that had unfolded in first class. Alan sat quietly, his eyes focused on the cabin window, though his mind was miles away, considering the changes that would soon come to his airline. He could still hear the occasional muffled sounds of conversation from the galley, where Emily remained hidden from view. Every so often, a flight attendant would pass through the cabin, glancing nervously in Alan's direction, their movements stiff as they tried to keep the atmosphere calm. As the plane began its descent into Seattle, the captain's voice crackled over the PA, announcing their approach and asking passengers to prepare for landing. Alan leaned back in his seat, closing his notebook with a satisfied click, knowing that the events of today would set in motion a deeper transformation within Skyline. Just as the cabin crew began final checks, Emily emerged from the galley, her face pale and her composure visibly rattled. She approached Alan's seat, her steps hesitant, as if each one took considerable effort. Passengers nearby watched her closely, some leaning forward to hear what might unfold next. Mr. Jackson, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to apologize. I didn't mean to. I didn't realize. Alan mithargaze. His expression calm but unyielding. Didn't realize what? Emily? That I might actually belong here? Her face flushed, and she opened her mouth, seemingly at a loss for words. I thought I was upholding standards. I thought that was what was expected of me. He nodded, choosing his next words carefully. And who defined those standards for you? Emily? Was it the uniform? The title? Or maybe something else entirely? Her gaze dropped to the floor, her hands twisting together nervously. I don't know. I guess I thought it was my job to protect the premium experience for those who, she trailed off, realizing too late that there was no way to finish her sentence without exposing the assumptions she'd been operating under. Alan let the silence hang for a moment, allowing her to feel the weight of her words. Emily, you've been with Skyline for how many years? 8, she replied, her voice barely a whisper. In those 8 years, did it ever occur to you that every passenger, regardless of their seat or their appearance, deserves the same level of respect? She nodded slowly, her face a mix of regret and embarrassment. Yes, I suppose it should have. I don't know why I didn't see it before. Maybe because no one challenged you, Alan replied, his voice softer now. Maybe because somewhere along the way, you began seeing your job as enforcing rules rather than understanding the people you serve. Emily looked away, her shoulders slumping. I suppose you're right, sir. Alan paused, then added, Emily, I didn't come on this flight today expecting to confront a problem like this, but I'm glad it happened, because it's given me a clearer picture of where we still need to improve. Her eyes met his again, a spark of hope flickering there. Does this mean I'm not going to lose my job? He considered her carefully. That depends. What I need from you now is more than an apology. I need commitment, a real willingness to change. Are you prepared for that? Yes, sir, she said, her voice steady, though her face showed traces of uncertainty. I want to do better. I want to learn from this. Alan nodded, pleased with her sincerity. Good. Then here's what's going to happen. I'll be following up with HR about this incident. And there will be additional training, not just for you, but for the entire staff. Skyline needs to remember why we're here. And I'm counting on you to be part of that change. As the plane touched down, the slight bump on the runway seemed to signal a fresh start. A reminder that even the steadiest flights encounter turbulence. The cabin filled with the sound of passengers unbuckling their seat belts, reaching for bags, and preparing to disembark. But Alan stayed seated, watching as Emily nodded, visibly humbled but determined. When the cabin doors opened, and the passengers began to file out, several people glanced back at Alan, offering him subtle nods of approval. The young tech worker gave him a thumbs up, a grin spreading across his face, while the businessman beside him muttered a quiet, "Nicely done," before stepping into the aisle. Alan rose slowly, gathering his belongings. As he stepped into the aisle, Karen, the senior flight attendant, approached him. "Mr. Jackson," she said, her voice full of respect, "we'd like to thank you for your patience and understanding today. If there's anything we can do to make this right, please let us know." He smiled, a calm but firm expression on his face. "Karen, thank you, but I believe the changes that need to happen are already in motion. You'll be hearing from me soon." With that, he made his way off the plane, stepping into the bustling Seattle terminal. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to ensure that Skyline would not only set the standard for customer service but also create a legacy of respect, dignity, and equality for every passenger who walked through its doors. As he exited the terminal, Alan knew the journey was far from over. This was just the beginning, a first step toward ensuring that every flight, every interaction, reflected the values he'd built Skyline on. And as he made his way through the airport, a sense of quiet satisfaction settled over him. Today had been challenging, yes, but it had also been necessary, a reminder of why he'd taken on this role in the first place. For Alan, the sky wasn't just a destination, it was an opportunity to make a difference. One flight at a time. Back at Skyline headquarters in Chicago, Alan's confrontation with Emily on the flight had already begun to ripple through the company. Word had spread quickly, not only about the incident itself but about Alan's commitment to changing the culture at Skyline from the ground up. The story, shared in hushed whispers among employees and informal meetings among executives, had become a pivotal moment, a reminder of what Skyline was supposed to represent. Alan wasted no time. In the days following his return, he convened a series of emergency meetings with his executive team. They gathered in the sleek, glass-walled conference room on the top floor of the headquarters, a room that offered sweeping views of the city skyline. The usual ease in these meetings had been replaced with a charged energy, the team waiting, anticipating the changes Alan was about to introduce. Standing at the head of the table, Alan spoke with quiet intensity. "Our company has grown beyond what any of us could have imagined. But along the way, we've lost sight of a core value, respect. It's not just about the policies we write, it's about the way we treat every single person who steps onto one of our planes." He paused, looking around the room, meeting each executive's gaze. Some looked at him with determination, others with uncertainty. But he could sense the impact his words were having. "We're not just fixing a problem with a single employee," Alan continued. "We're addressing a flaw in our culture. Effective immediately. Skyline will be implementing a comprehensive training program focused on empathy, dignity, and inclusivity. We're not going to tolerate biases, conscious or unconscious, any longer." His chief human resources officer, Dana, nodded thoughtfully. "We've had anti-discrimination policies in place for years, Alan," she said. "But perhaps they haven't gone far enough. People need to feel those values, not just read them in a manual." "Exactly," Alan replied, his eyes alight with purpose. "From now on, every employee, from flight attendants to executives, will undergo rigorous training. We'll be using real-world scenarios, like the one I experienced, to help everyone understand the subtle, often unintentional ways we fail to treat people equally." Alan's experience with Emily had shown him that policies alone weren't enough. What Skyline needed was a deep, systemic change, a shift in attitude and perspective that would be felt by every employee and every passenger. And this transformation, he knew, would have to start from the top. In the days that followed, Skyline launched a pilot version of the new training program. Flight attendants, customer service agents, and ground staff gathered in Skyline's main training center, a sprawling facility designed to simulate everything from check-in counters to aircraft cabins. The atmosphere in the room was one of curiosity mixed with a hint of skepticism. Employees who had heard rumors about the incident on the flight knew that the program was being driven by something more personal, something close to the CEO's heart. On the first day of training, Alan stood at the front of the room, his presence both surprising and humbling to the employees gathered. He had shed his usual business attire, dressed instead in a simple shirt and slacks, a deliberate choice to emphasize his commitment to these changes. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice calm but powerful. "You've all heard about the incident on my recent flight. What happened that day was unacceptable. And it's something I take personally, not because of my position, but because of my principles. Every person deserves respect, regardless of who they are or what they're wearing." The room was silent, the employees visibly attentive, some exchanging glances, others nodding slightly. Alan took a breath, letting the silence settle. "Our program is about more than just fixing a problem. It's about changing the way we think, the way we interact, and the way we understand one another." Skyline is committed to being a place where everyone feels valued and respected. But we can only achieve that if each of us truly believes in it. Alan invited a familiar face to join him at the front of the room, Mike Chin, the young tech worker who had recorded the flight incident and had since agreed to partner with Skyline as part of its cultural shift. Standing beside Alan, Mike spoke to the employees, sharing his experience as a frequent traveler who often felt judged based on his appearance, not his status. "I'm not here as some kind of expert," Mike said, his tone humble yet firm. "I'm here as a reminder that every passenger has a story. Some of us travel for work, some for family, some out of necessity. It's not our job to look a certain way, it's yours to make sure everyone feels welcome." The employees listened closely, many visibly affected by his words. Alan watched, his heart swelling with hope as he saw the message resonate. Later in the day, employees participated in a series of interactive exercises designed to challenge their biases and assumptions. They were given scenarios similar to those Alan had observed on his flight, and each one sparked honest discussions. Some flight attendants admitted they'd unconsciously treated certain passengers differently, while others reflected on the small judgments they'd made based on appearance or behavior. During a lunch break, Alan walked around the room, talking with employees, answering questions, and encouraging them to speak openly. He could see the impact this was having, a genuine shift in understanding and empathy. At one point, he spotted Emily, who had been sitting quietly at the back, her eyes downcast as she listened to her colleagues' reflections. Alan made his way over to her, and she looked up, meeting his gaze with a tentative smile. "Thank you for being here, Emily," he said, his voice kind but firm. "I know it must be difficult, but I hope you understand how important this is, not just for the company, but for you." She nodded, her eyes filled with a new determination. "I do, Mr. Jackson. I'm starting to see things differently. I realize now that I was part of the problem." Alan offered her an encouraging nod. "Awareness is the first step toward change. What matters now is what you do with it." The training session continued, and by the end of the day, the atmosphere had shifted. Employees left the room with a renewed sense of purpose. Their perspectives broadened, and their understanding deepened. The incident on Alan's flight had sparked something powerful, a movement toward a kinder, more inclusive culture at Skyline. As the training program expanded, feedback poured in from employees across all levels. Flight attendants, customer service agents, and even members of the executive team expressed a newfound commitment to Skyline's values. Alan knew the journey was far from over, but he felt a deep sense of pride as he saw his vision taking shape. 2 months later, Skyline unveiled its revamped service program, branded as Flight with Dignity. The initiative was featured in national news outlets, praised for its focus on respect and empathy in an industry often criticized for its rigid hierarchies. Alan had transformed his experience with Emily into a symbol of change, a reminder that the real power of an airline was not just in the planes it flew but in the people it served. In the months that followed, Alan continued to monitor the program's progress, attending training sessions, talking with employees, and even taking a few more incognito flights to observe the changes firsthand. He noticed a difference, the small but significant gestures, the genuine smiles, the ease with which passengers were greeted regardless of their appearance. One day, as he walked through the terminal at O'Hare, Alan overheard a flight attendant talking to a young family struggling with luggage. "Don't worry," she said warmly. "We're here to help, no matter where you're sitting." Alan couldn't help but smile. It was a small moment, almost unnoticeable, but it represented everything he'd worked for. He knew that Skyline was becoming the airline he'd always envisioned, a place where dignity and respect were as essential as the wings on each plane. And for Alan, that was worth more than any title or position. It was a legacy of compassion. And he knew, deep in his heart, that Skyline was finally soaring toward the future he had always dreamed of. 2 months had passed since the incident on Alan's flight, and the atmosphere at Skyline Airways had begun to change in subtle yet powerful ways. Employees across every department felt it, a renewed sense of purpose, a deeper understanding of what it meant to work at an airline that genuinely cared about its people and its passengers. Alan Jackson, CEO, had set the tone for a culture shift that was becoming the heartbeat of the company. At headquarters, the Flight with Dignity program had become more than just a training initiative, it was a movement. Posters lined the walls, displaying Skyline's core values in bold letters: respect, empathy, dignity. In break rooms and offices, employees spoke openly about their experiences with the new training, sharing personal stories and reflections sparked by the sessions. There was a palpable shift, an unspoken agreement to hold each other accountable and to carry these values into every aspect of their work. Alan had been heavily involved in the rollout, attending several sessions himself and making a point to show his support in visible ways. But today was a different kind of day. Today, he would see the fruits of this cultural shift firsthand. Not as the CEO but as a passenger once again. Dressed in casual clothes and carrying only a small leather bag, Alan made his way through O'Hare International, blending in with the crowd as he'd done countless times before. This time, however, he felt a renewed sense of optimism. He was ready to see if Skyline had truly embraced the changes he had worked so hard to implement. As he checked in and made his way to the gate, he observed his surroundings with a keen eye, noting the behaviors of the employees. The gate agent greeted him with a warm smile, asking if he needed any assistance. There was no hesitation, no judgment, just a genuine, welcoming demeanor. Alan responded with a polite, "Thank you," feeling a spark of pride as he took his place among the other travelers. Once boarding was called, he stepped onto the plane, his eyes discreetly watching every detail. A young flight attendant, Emma, greeted him as he entered the cabin. She didn't know him, of that he was sure, but her smile was warm and her body language open. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, her tone cheerful. "Welcome aboard. If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to let us know." "Thank you," Alan replied, impressed by her sincerity. He made his way down the aisle, noting the atmosphere around him. Passengers seemed relaxed, and the crew moved with an energy that felt different, genuine, not forced. The usual sense of hierarchy, that invisible barrier that had once permeated first class, was nowhere to be seen. Taking his seat in economy, Alan settled in and continued his observations. Across the aisle, a young mother struggled with her baby, trying to juggle her bags while keeping the child calm. Emma noticed immediately, stepping over to offer her assistance. "Here, let me help you with that," she said gently, taking the bag from the mother's shoulder and placing it in the overhead compartment. "And if you need anything during the flight, just press the call button." The mother gave her a grateful smile, visibly relieved. "Thank you so much." Alan watched the exchange with a quiet satisfaction. These were the moments that mattered, the simple acts of kindness, the willingness to go beyond what was required. Emma wasn't just following a script, she was embodying the values Skyline had set out to achieve. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Alan noticed another familiar face in the cabin, Chris, the flight attendant who had assisted him during the original incident with Emily. Chris moved through the aisle with an easy confidence, checking seat belts and helping passengers settle in. When he reached Alan's row, he offered a nod and a smile, clearly unaware of Alan's true identity. "Is there anything I can get for you, sir?" Chris asked, his tone as genuine as ever. "No thank you," Alan replied, his voice filled with a quiet pride. "I'm good." The plane ascended, and as it reached cruising altitude, the flight attendants began their service. Emma returned to the mother across the aisle, offering her a bottle of water and a small snack for the baby, her voice soft and caring. Nearby, Chris assisted an elderly man who needed help reclining his seat, chatting with him as if they were old friends. Alan's heart swelled as he observed these interactions. This wasn't just customer service, it was a new way of being, a reflection of the values he had worked so hard to instill. For the first time in years, he felt like Skyline had finally become the airline he'd always dreamed of. About halfway through the flight, a small commotion arose in first class. A businessman was arguing with one of the flight attendants, insisting that he needed special treatment because of his premium status. Alan watched as Emma approached, her face calm but resolute. "I'm sorry, sir," she said politely, "but we treat all our passengers with the same respect and care. If there's anything you need within reason, I'd be happy to help." The man, taken aback by her calm firmness, seemed to reconsider his demands. He muttered something under his breath, then sank back into his seat, clearly displeased but unwilling to press further. Emma walked away, her expression unfazed. Alan couldn't help but smile, feeling a deep respect for her professionalism. She hadn't let the man's status intimidate her, instead, she'd upheld the principles Skyline had committed to, treating every passenger with the same level of respect. As the flight continued, Alan felt a sense of peace settle over him. This was more than a job, it was a mission. A commitment to create a better experience for every person who set foot on a Skyline plane. And while there would always be challenges, he knew that his employees were prepared to face them with integrity. When the plane touched down in Los Angeles, Alan waited until the last passengers had disembarked before rising from his seat. He made his way to the front of the cabin, where Emma and Chris were preparing for the next flight. "Excuse me," he said, catching their attention. They both turned, surprised to see him lingering. "Yes, sir?" Emma asked, her smile polite. Alan extended his hand. "I just wanted to thank you, both of you, for the work you're doing here. It makes a difference." Chris shook his hand, his eyes widening as he seemed to recognize Alan's face. "Thank you, Mr. Jackson. I didn't realize." Emma's eyes widened as well, a flicker of surprise and awe crossing her face. You're the CEO?" Alan nodded, giving them a warm smile. "I am. And I couldn't be prouder of the work you're doing. It's people like you who make Skyline what it is." Emma's face flushed with pride, and Chris grinned, clearly moved. "Thank you, sir," Emma said, her voice soft. "That means a lot." Alan nodded once more, feeling a sense of satisfaction he hadn't felt in a long time. As he walked off the plane, he knew that Skyline's culture had truly changed. The dedication, the respect, the kindness, these were now woven into the fabric of the company. Walking through the terminal, Alan felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He knew the journey was far from over. But for now, he could take a moment to appreciate how far they had come. Skyline Airways was soaring higher than ever. Not just because of its planes, but because of the people who believed in its mission. And for Alan, there was no greater achievement. Alan leaned back in his office chair, gazing out at the cityscape of Chicago from the top floor of Skyline's headquarters. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the buildings. And he felt a quiet pride settle in his chest. He had spent his career building this company from the ground up. But never had he felt so close to realizing the culture he had always envisioned. Skyline was changing, not just in policy but in spirit. And today, he would see that transformation come full circle. In the past few months, the Flight with Dignity program had taken root in ways Alan hadn't anticipated. Complaints had decreased, and feedback from passengers was overwhelmingly positive. Stories of flight attendants helping elderly passengers, engaging with families, and treating every customer with genuine respect circulated through the company. Alan had read each one with a sense of pride. Knowing these were no longer just isolated moments, they were the new standard. Today, however, was special. Alan had invited Emily, the flight attendant from that pivotal flight, to his office. After completing her intensive training and returning to work, Emily had been a model of growth and transformation, and she had requested this meeting to share her experiences. A soft knock on his door pulled Alan from his thoughts. "Come in," he called, straightening in his chair. The door opened, and Emily entered, her posture humble but confident. She wore her Skyline uniform with pride, her eyes bright as she stepped forward. "Mr. Jackson," she said, offering a nervous smile. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Alan gestured for her to sit. "Emily, it's good to see you. And please, call me Alan." She sat down, exhaling slowly. "Thank you, Alan," she said, glancing around the office before meeting his eyes. "I wanted to thank you for giving me a second chance. I wasn't sure I deserved it after what happened. But you showed me that I could be better." Alan nodded, his expression encouraging. "I'm glad you feel that way. Emily, tell me, how have things been since you returned?" She took a moment to gather her thoughts. "It's been different. At first, I was nervous. I was afraid people would judge me, that they'd see me as the problem flight attendant. But the training helped me see things from a new perspective. I started to understand my own biases, and I realized how much my attitude affected the passengers and the entire crew." Alan listened intently, nodding as she spoke. "And how do you feel now?" "Honestly, I feel like a different person. Every time I board a plane, I remind myself that each passenger is unique. They all have their own stories, their own reasons for being there. It's not my place to judge. It's my job to make them feel welcomed." She paused, her expression softening. "I had one passenger a few weeks ago, a young woman flying alone with her toddler. She looked exhausted, overwhelmed. A few months ago, I probably would have been annoyed, thinking about the disruption. But instead, I remembered what you said about dignity. About seeing each passenger as more than just a seat number." Alan's eyes lit up with pride. "And how did that change your approach?" "I offered to help her with her bags. Brought a few coloring books and snacks for the child. I saw the relief in her face, the gratitude. And I realized, it was so simple. Just a few extra minutes of kindness. But it made all the difference for her. She even wrote a thank you note to the airline." Emily smiled, her voice warm. "Moments like that remind me of why I'm here." Alan felt a surge of satisfaction as he listened to her story. Emily's transformation was proof that change was possible, even in an industry where hierarchies and biases had been ingrained for years. "Emily," he said, leaning forward, "your story is exactly what I hoped for when we started this program. You took responsibility for your actions, and you used that experience to grow. I couldn't be prouder." She beamed, her expression one of genuine pride and gratitude. "Thank you, Alan. That means a lot." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. Finally, Alan spoke again, his tone thoughtful. "Emily, I'd like you to consider taking on a new role at Skyline. We're expanding the Flight with Dignity program, and we need someone who understands the importance of respect and empathy in a very personal way. I think you'd be perfect for leading these training sessions, helping other employees understand the power of treating every passenger with dignity." Her eyes widened in surprise, and then a smile spread across her face. I would be honored, Alan. Truly. If I can help others learn what I've learned, I'd love to be part of that." "Excellent," Alan replied, nodding approvingly. "We'll start with a few sessions next month, and from there, we'll expand to ensure that every employee, from gate agents to executives, understands our vision." As their meeting ended, Alan stood, extending his hand. Emily shook it firmly, her gratitude evident. Thank you, Alan, for believing in me. Thank you, Emily, for believing in yourself, he replied. You've shown us all what growth looks like. When she left, Alan felt a renewed sense of purpose. Skyline wasn't just changing its culture, it was building a legacy. The Flight with Dignity program was now more than a training initiative, it was a testament to the power of humility, growth, and respect. Later that evening, as Alan reviewed the feedback from recent passenger surveys, he noticed a recurring theme in the comments: passengers felt genuinely valued. They appreciated the small gestures, the kindness shown by the crew, the sense that they were more than just faces in a crowd. For Alan, these were the true markers of success. As he prepared to leave for the day, he looked around his office, feeling a profound satisfaction. Skyline Airways was finally aligned with his vision, a place where everyone, from passengers to employees, was treated with the same level of dignity and respect. This wasn't just a victory for the company. It was a personal triumph, a fulfillment of the values he had carried with him since his days as a baggage handler. Alan knew that the work was far from over, that the journey of transformation was ongoing. But for the first time, he felt confident that Skyline would continue to soar, its wings strengthened by the collective commitment to kindness and equality. And as he turned off the lights and stepped into the quiet evening, Alan knew that he was leaving a legacy far more lasting than any corporate title or accomplishment. He was leaving a legacy of respect, one that would ripple through every flight, every interaction, every small act of kindness. For years to come, Alan arrived at the bustling terminal of JFK Airport, dressed casually and blending into the crowd like any other traveler. Today, however, he wasn't just here to observe. He was taking a special flight, one that Skyline Airways had decided to test for a new initiative they'd been quietly working on. Known as the Skyline Experience, this initiative aimed to take the Flight with Dignity program to new heights, creating an atmosphere where every passenger felt like a valued guest. Alan wanted to see, firsthand, how far his airline had come. As he checked in at the counter, the gate agent greeted him warmly. "Good morning, sir. Welcome to Skyline Airways. How can I assist you today?" "Just here for my flight," Alan said with a friendly smile, handing over his boarding pass. She scanned it quickly, her face lighting up as she saw his name. "Mr. Jackson. It's an honor to have you with us," she said quietly, her professionalism unwavering. But there was a glimmer of recognition in her eyes. Alan could tell that word of his presence on the flight had traveled through the staff. "Thank you," he replied, keeping his tone casual. "Please, treat me just like any other passenger." She nodded, her smile never wavering. "Of course, sir. And if there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to let us know." Alan boarded with the economy passengers, walking down the aisle and greeting crew members along the way. As he settled into his seat near the middle of the plane, he glanced around, observing the atmosphere with a quiet sense of pride. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with a confidence and warmth that was unmistakable. Gone were the subtle hierarchies and quiet judgments he had once noticed. In their place was a genuine openness, a readiness to assist every passenger, no matter their ticket class. The cabin filled quickly, and Alan watched the interactions unfolding around him. Across the aisle, an elderly couple was struggling to store their carry-on bag. Without hesitation, a flight attendant named Sarah stepped forward, offering a gentle smile as she lifted the bag into the overhead bin. "Let me take care of that for you," she said kindly, ensuring they were comfortable before moving on. Nearby, a young father with his toddler son juggled snacks and toys, trying to keep his child entertained. Another flight attendant, James, noticed and walked over, offering a set of crayons and a coloring book. A small but thoughtful gesture that was met with visible relief. "Thank you," the father said, looking up at James with gratitude. "You've just saved my day." "Anytime," James replied, kneeling down to speak to the child. "And if you need any more snacks or anything else, just let me know." Alan couldn't help but feel a surge of pride as he watched these interactions unfold. This was the kind of environment he had always dreamed of creating, an airline where every passenger felt seen, valued, and respected. The kindness and empathy his crew displayed were no longer isolated acts but an integral part of Skyline's culture. As the flight took off and reached cruising altitude, the crew began the in-flight service. Alan watched as Sarah moved through the aisles with a natural ease, engaging passengers in conversation, sharing smiles, and making each person feel welcome. When she reached Alan's row, she offered him a warm smile. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, her tone friendly. "Can I get you something to drink?" "Just water." "Thank you," Alan replied. She nodded, handing him a bottle with a smile. "Please let me know if there's anything else you need." He took a sip of water, watching as she continued down the aisle, attentive to every passenger's needs. He felt a sense of fulfillment, knowing that these gestures, small as they might seem, were what truly defined the Skyline experience. Partway through the flight, Alan felt a tap on his shoulder. Turning, he found himself face to face with Mike Chin, the tech executive who had been on the infamous flight that started it all. Mike's eyes sparkled with amusement as he extended his hand. Mr. Jackson. I thought that was you. Mike said, grinning. Good to see you again. I didn't expect to run into you here. Mike, Alan replied, shaking his hand. It's good to see you too. Are you traveling for business? Mike nodded, settling into the seat beside him. Yes, though I'm happy to say Skyline is now my preferred airline. I've seen the difference firsthand. Alan chuckled, feeling a swell of pride. I'm glad to hear that. I take it you've noticed some changes? Oh, absolutely, Mike said, nodding emphatically. The way your crew treats passengers is night and day compared to that first flight. People are happier. The service feels genuine. And it's clear they really care. I had a flight last month where the crew went out of their way to help an elderly passenger get to her connecting flight. They didn't just help, they practically escorted her through the airport, making sure she felt safe. Alan smiled, touched by the story. That's exactly the kind of culture we're building. Dignity, respect, empathy, those are the foundations of the new Skyline. Mike leaned back, watching the flight attendants move through the cabin with a thoughtful look. I think you're onto something big here, Alan. It's not just about flying people from one place to another. You're creating a meaningful experience. The words resonated deeply with Alan. He had always believed that an airline could be more than just a business. That it could embody a set of values that people felt every time they flew. He'd faced plenty of resistance, countless moments of doubt. But seeing the results firsthand confirmed that he was on the right path. The rest of the flight passed in quiet contentment. Alan chatted with Mike about the tech industry, his plans for Skyline, and even shared a few laughs about their shared experiences with prejudice and resilience. When the plane finally touched down, Alan felt a profound sense of accomplishment, as if a chapter had closed on his journey to transform Skyline. As he prepared to disembark, Alan noticed Sarah and James standing by the exit, saying goodbye to each passenger with genuine warmth. When it was his turn, he paused, extending his hand to each of them. Thank you for your hard work today, he said. You're doing an amazing job. Sarah looked slightly taken aback but smiled, shaking his hand. Thank you, sir. That means a lot. James nodded, his expression sincere. We're proud to work here, Mr. Jackson. Skyline feels like a family now. Alan's chest tightened with emotion. That's exactly what I hoped for. Keep up the good work. As he stepped off the plane and into the terminal, Alan felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. The Flight with Dignity program had become more than just a set of policies, it was a way of life. A new standard in the airline industry. He knew there would still be challenges. Still moments when the old ways would try to creep back in. But for now, he felt confident that Skyline had found its true direction. Outside the terminal, Alan paused to look up at the bright blue sky, watching as another Skyline plane soared overhead. In that moment, he knew that he had achieved something remarkable. He had created a legacy, not of power, not of profit, but of compassion, respect, and humanity. The airline industry might be known for its ups and downs, but as long as Skyline Airways continued to fly, Alan knew it would carry his vision, uplifting each passenger and reminding them, one flight at a time, that they were valued. And for Alan, there was no greater legacy. A crisp autumn breeze swept through Chicago as Alan arrived at Skyline Airways headquarters, his steps light yet purposeful. Today marked a milestone for the company, a day he had long envisioned but was finally here. In just a few hours, Skyline would launch the Flight with Dignity program as an industry-wide initiative, setting a new standard for airline customer service that had already captured public attention. The media had picked up on Skyline's cultural shift, with headlines lauding the company's commitment to empathy and respect. Competitors were taking note, and other airlines had begun reaching out to Skyline's HR department, requesting insight into their new approach. Alan could hardly believe it, his vision was spreading, influencing an industry that was often reluctant to change. Inside the Skyline Training Center, employees were gathering, filling the room with anticipation. There was an energy in the air, a blend of excitement, pride, and hope. Every seat was filled with flight attendants, gate agents, customer service representatives, and corporate staff, all of whom had come to witness the formal launch of the program. In the front row sat familiar faces, Chris, the flight attendant whose kindness had first inspired Alan's observations, and Emily, now a leading advocate for the program she had once unknowingly resisted. As Alan took the stage, the room fell silent. Every face turned toward him, each person attentive and eager. Good morning, everyone, he began, his voice resonating with quiet authority. Thank you for being here. Today is more than just the launch of a program, it's the culmination of a journey we've all taken together. He paused, letting his words sink in. I started my career loading bags on tarmacs, working shifts in all kinds of weather, and handling every sort of passenger issue you can imagine. Over the years, I've seen this industry from every angle, and I can tell you that the most important thing I've learned is that people, whether they're passengers or employees, want to be treated with dignity and respect. The room remained silent, But Alan could see nods of agreement from employees who had their own stories, their own experiences in the trenches of customer service. I've always believed Skyline could be different, he continued. Not just another airline but a community. We're not just moving people from one place to another, we're a part of their journey. Whether they're flying to reunite with family, start a new chapter, or simply explore the world, every passenger deserves to feel like they belong. He looked out at the crowd, his eyes meeting Emily's for a brief moment. She offered a small, grateful smile, her gaze filled with both humility and pride. And that's why we're here today. Flight with Dignity isn't just a slogan, it's our new standard. It's how we're going to lead this industry, not through fancy ads or flashy promises, but through our actions, through the way we treat every single person who walks onto our planes. The audience erupted in applause, the energy in the room building with every clap. Alan felt a swell of pride as he looked at his team, knowing that they believed in this vision as deeply as he did. When the applause died down, he continued. To those of you who have been with Skyline for years, and to those of you who are new to our family, I want you to know that you're part of something special. We're creating a legacy, one that will live on far beyond any one of us. And I want you all to know just how proud I am of each and every one of you. Alan stepped aside as Dana, the Chief Human Resources Officer, took the stage to outline the specifics of the program. The Flight with Dignity initiative was not just about training, it was a complete cultural shift. Employees would receive ongoing development in empathy, cultural awareness, and conflict resolution. Leadership workshops would be offered across all levels, with a special focus on understanding unconscious bias and fostering inclusivity. The program was designed not only to improve customer service but to enrich the lives of the employees themselves. Following Dana's presentation, a few employees were invited to share their stories. Emily took the microphone, her hand steady, her voice filled with conviction. Some of you know my story, she began, glancing around the room. I was the flight attendant who, months ago, didn't recognize the CEO on board and treated him differently because he didn't look like a first-class passenger. She paused, taking a deep breath. That moment changed my life. And while I was embarrassed and ashamed at first, Mr. Jackson's response taught me something powerful. I learned that respect is not about status, appearance, or assumptions. It's about understanding, kindness, and seeing the human in everyone. Her words resonated with the audience, a reminder of the transformation they'd all been a part of. She looked back at Alan, her face full of gratitude. Thank you, Alan, for believing in me, and for showing all of us that growth is possible if we're willing to face our mistakes. The room erupted in applause, a tribute not just to Emily's courage but to the journey they had all taken together. After the event, Alan walked through the crowd, shaking hands, sharing words of encouragement, and listening to his employees. Many approached him with stories of their own, how the program had helped them connect with passengers, how they had faced their own biases, how they had come to see Skyline as more than just a job. As the last of the employees began to filter out, Alan found himself standing alone in the training center. He took a deep breath, savoring the quiet moment. This wasn't just about launching a program, it was about setting a new standard in an industry that had needed it for so long. He knew there would be challenges ahead, moments when they'd face resistance or criticism. But for now, he felt confident, knowing that Skyline was leading with purpose, carrying the values of dignity and respect in every flight, every interaction. Leaving the building, Alan felt lighter, his heart full. As he stepped outside, the sun was setting, casting the city in a warm, golden light. He looked up at the sky, watching as a Skyline plane soared overhead, its contrails cutting a clean, unwavering path across the horizon. In that moment, Alan knew that he had achieved something more meaningful than he had ever imagined. Skyline Airways was no longer just a company, it was a legacy, a beacon of respect and compassion in the skies. And as long as the planes continued to fly, his vision of dignity and humanity would soar with them, reminding every passenger that they were valued, that they belonged, and that Skyline was a place where respect always took flight. For Alan, this was his life's work, a purpose that stretched beyond business, beyond profits. This was his gift to the world, a legacy that would touch the lives of countless passengers, each one lifted by the simple, powerful promise of being treated with dignity. And with that, Alan walked into the twilight, knowing that Skyline's future was brighter than ever.